We're going to now talk about multiplanar, multi-vector. And the pause moment is look at your philosophy, look at your ethos, look how you decide your program. Like if I was going to say, hey, come up with a program in under 30 seconds, go. It's going to default to some sort of pattern that you've evolved over the years, whether it was weight room driven, like I only have accessibility to barbells and dumbbells and kettlebells, so that's going to be the lion's share of my program. Or if it's an open field with minimal equipment, there's a whole host of things that influence our default pattern, right? We are always regressing to some sort of mean. And where I look at, there's been a couple of models that look at different planes and different vectors, like a Gary Gray and the concept of tweakology and looking at your prime patterns, much like Ian King or Paul Chek or Vern Gambetta would come up with and saying, here's your base patterns of squat, lunge, hinge, push, and pull. And what Gray came in and said, hey, we can do those on all three planes. Like we can do a sagittal orientation of a lunge, a frontal orientation of that, or we can do a transverse. Then they looked at vectors of, hey, well, we can grab a med ball and we can move through a vertical vector, a horizontal vector, a rotational vector, while going through these different locomotive patterns. We can do that with all our base patterns. And we're going to talk here in a second about training and trainable, that the idea of typically what we default, and this is where we are going to be naturally hardwired to gravitate to, is something that we can quantify and objectively say, I did my job. And that idea of a trainable pattern versus a training pattern. Training is really just progressive overload based, and that becomes the focal point in which we decide or make decisions from. And again, it's not a bad thing to default to because people are getting stronger, getting better, and then all of a sudden it leads into better short-term performance. But then it has a ceiling. And one of the things that you find is we live in a chaotic, multivariate, three-dimensional world, and there's no predicting what's going to happen from one second to the next. And we are amplifying that level of chaos with the insurgence of environment, the organism, the task, a Newell's model-based approach, and then we can look at it from a basic, just simple, like the whole point is to not know what your opponent's going to do, because if they're good at their job, you have less awareness. So you're trying to whittle it down to some sort of thing that's predictable, but truth is it's still going to be chaotic and read, interpret, make a decision. And there's always going to be those little micro movements. And one of the concepts that will be broken down in this is there's no two patterns the same. This is a Bernstein's law. Even a redundant worker like a blacksmith just hammering metal all day, and this is what the motor learning research showed, that there's always a slight deviance, whether it was an environmental aspect, there was an organismal aspect of the person just got started getting fatigued or looked elsewhere while he was swinging. There's something of that nature that altered that extremely repetitive pattern. And we can't say that a whittled down inventory of exercise like squat, hinge, lunge, push, and pull is going to be the same every single time. And we can further prepare them or correspond to what we want to accomplish within sport by thinking with different planes of motion, different vectors, different variations to enhance that. And one of the things about acyclical team-based sports, meaning that they're not going to do the same pattern over and over again, versus cyclical, they're just doing the same pattern, whether it's biking, walking, or running, that the more exercise variation we can include within a training session, a microcycle, a mesocycle, and a macrocycle, the better transference we're going to have towards that sport. And I'm working really hard to illuminate the fact that you have blind spots and gaps in your programs, and a lot of it's dictated about your weight room. A lot of it's dictated by what you know and your history. A lot of it's dictated by your predecessors. A lot of it's dictated by your against the clock. You got to actually prove or substantiate the value in what you're doing. And those are all legitimate, real things. But when I would come back and tell you right now is in order to level up your programming, you're going to have to find a way to close that gap of limited planes and limited vector based training. And there's a moment of like, hey, I'm just going to put that in the movement prep. Great. I'm going to do that in terms of some sort of pairings. Or I'm going to put it in the C series. I'm going to do it more in conditioning. All these are really novel ways to approach this central problem of I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater with my programming and still have to accomplish something, but I need to include different planes of motion and different vectors in order to best prepare my athletes. And again, like there's like a built-in excuse, there's a sunk cost, there's just an investment, there's an interesting, there's a novelty, there's a effect of getting a piece of equipment like Flywheel that just opens up these redundant neural mappings as you make decisions, right? One of the things that we talk a lot about with motor learning is this hardwired neural mapping. And the more repetitive we do something, the more it becomes like second nature, which is natural. And then we start to add an influence to it, right? So let's go back to a squat and we change the resistance profile from momentum and angular velocity through inertia as opposed to gravity and just external load, that the athlete now has to reorganize themselves and figure out how to traverse and navigate this new element to this redundant pattern that be done over and over, and they accentuate that and have a greater bandwidth and a greater tolerance, and they're more prepared. And they just like slight deviations make a huge difference. But correspondence is going to be the case here. Now, when we get into this idea of multiplanar, multivector, I think fractals is a rule in math and nature that simple rules are going to repeat itself, right? So what is true on a microscopic level will be true on a macroscopic level. And a lot of times when we break down patterns eventually they're going to do some sort of variation of a squat, lunge, and hinge in competition. So we're just breaking it down into compartmentalized, siloed off patterns, and we're going to overload that in some way. Great. But then it progresses closer to season and it gets more specific, whether that comes in the form of practice, comes in the form of drills and rehearsals that are preparing them for that. Or there could be a model where we're reverse engineering the specific action they're doing in their sport through training. That we're not doing training, we're doing prep for the specific activities to do. And you got the big three between Yeses, Bondarchuk, and I think James Smith did a really good job in breaking it down. And all these kind of fall into this like evolution of there's general to specific, or there's preparatory exercises and specialization exercises. There's this idea of a unified theory of training of hitting all the biomotor, biomechanic, psychological aspects, and really breaking down the truth of the matter of we have to start to think more towards correspondence without limiting our ability to develop and enhance. That we should have something objectively proven through the end of a training cycle, but not losing sight of the fact that we still need to close the gap of having that athlete perform at a higher level when they're in competition in a chaotic, open environment that they're not going to be able to effectively be as prepared as everything we would love them to be. And just framing that and going into it and being more conscious of what the demands on the court of the field are, being more conscious of what the limitations of that athlete is, listening more to the position coaches and the coaches and their athletes talking about here's where I feel my gap is, and here's where I feel like I'm deficient in, or here's where I feel like I'm not clicking on the field or the court the way I want. And they go, okay, what can I close the gap with? And I'm great at general physical preparation. I'm one of the best in the world. I'm probably a really crappy sports coach. Like I just don't know if I can translate it as well as I should. But I'm a key observer and I'm a good listener. And I want to think about, okay, well, if they need to backpedal more effectively as a defensive back, what can I do to enhance that ability? Whether it's breaking it down by joint, whether it's breaking it down biomechanic, like, all right, they got to go retro. How do I develop posterior chain? How to develop this core strength? How do I develop the timing and rhythm of locomotion and retro patterning? How do I develop from a sequencing or a tissue or a elasticity component? Like all that stuff is, I think, within my scope and my purview to develop and enhance an athlete's ability to do the job that they need to do on the field. And that's my role here. That's what I'm thinking about. And I think with Flywheel and even different forms of resistance have come in, is the truth is that I look at that and I say, okay, I can close that gap where that athlete's deficient in. I know what the limitation in here is from a biomechanic, biomotor, or even bioenergetic standpoint. I can enhance that. And I can give them a better platform in which to develop or have a higher ceiling, right? The whole idea of a pyramid is based off the base. The higher the peak is based off the larger the base. And I think that's where general physical preparation really comes in. But we can help enhance that GPP or that general preparatory work to be more facilitative to what they need from either a multiplanar or multivector, or we'll talk about in the next lesson, a contraction type, looking at eccentric, isometric, and concentric. And that dynamic is invaluable. So we start to think about this idea, and I mentioned this when we first started to open the slide, was this idea of trainable versus training. And I defined it here for you. So training is not exclusive to exercise that we can progressively overload with intensity, volume, or density. We think about training, right? I'm going to do my squat, hinges, lunges, pushes, and pulls as things I can progressively overload, right? Remember the big three in terms of intensity, I'm going to add weight. The volume, I'm going to do time and attention, reps, or increase sets. Or I look at density, compressing, and expanding. And then I have trainable, which is locomotive skills that develop with just competency. So if you ever came across something like aqua bags, or if you ever come across like Kaiser or pneumatic resistance, or maybe bands, and you go, okay, well, what do I do week 1 to week 2? Right? That's It's an interesting question, right? When your athlete gets to the C series and they're doing a tall kneeling Palloff press and they go, okay, well, like with a band, and they go, well, what should I do next week? And you're like, all right, my default is go up in volume because I can't change the intensity. So we're going to do more reps, or might do more sets, or might do more time and attention. That's my default to going, okay, what is a training pattern? But then like a trainable, right? Like maybe they sucked week 1. I just need to enhance their ability to do it correctly week 2. And that's some sort of progression in locomotive ability. It's more subjective. It's definitely harder to ascertain what the actual adaptation rate thereof or ability. But then there's a transference and a correspondence thing to think about. Like, well, they're more capable of resisting rotation when they're perpendicular to the resistance. And maybe that ties into decelerative work in the frontal or the transverse plane. Maybe that ties into being more rigid at the point of contact. Who knows? But my point is when you get to this flywheel and you're looking at it, what is a progression from one week to the next? We talked about intensity and volume, but through inertia or in velocity. But the next level will be this truth of the matter is the competency in which you're moving. And if you've ever done like a rotational row where you're perpendicularly aligned to the resistance and you're pulling across your body, you're trying to rotate in the back leg, there's less about like, I'm not really as concerned about the external load. I'm just more about looking at is their timing, their foot rotating, their tibia rotating, their femur rotating, that pelvis internally rotating, and then finishing by thoracic spine rotation. Can they time it? And then can they decelerate that load? Can they go into this propulsion and loading continuum or react and unload like effectively? And it just comes a little different point of view. And I'm like, they have competency is what I'm looking for. And that's a trainable pattern that we're training still, but we're looking at it from not from the purview of progressive overload, but what is the actual ability to do that movement successfully? Actions. One thing that will help you in this process is think about concentric as propulsion and think about eccentric as loading, right? That essentially we're just pushing fluids around our body. So we're moving fluids from an open space from a closed space to an open space. So if I flex my elbow, I am pushing the fluids from the inside of my elbow to the outside of my elbow. And I'm just pushing fluids in and out all around my body. Then my body's just a big water bag with bones that are just moving fluids from one end to the other. And if I look at rotation, I'm just managing fluids going through my body in this rotational vector. And if I'm looking at the tissues, maybe it's external oblique, maybe it's a little iliacus, maybe it's a little QL, maybe it's something serratus, who knows? We do know. But the point being is that when we look at it, it's just pushing fluid one way, and then I'm reacting, it's tissues on that opposite side, and I'm pulling in the other. And that propulsion and loading, instead of just thinking about this from like binary classification of concentric, eccentric, when we're thinking about transverse and rotational, it'll help a lot to think about, okay, I'm loading and I'm propulsing, like that difference. And that dynamic or that slight tweak of terminology will allow you to be more malleable to this maybe less than perfect solution we look at from, hey, that's eccentrically loading, right? Because you'll get into like a rotational chop or a rotational lift or a rotational row, and it's harder to find because they're not really targeting a specific muscle or a specific joint action. It's multi-joint or compound. It's multiple muscle groups working simultaneously, and the pattern is not as clean or delineated as a squat or a hinge or a push or a pull. That I'm working essentially fascial lines and cross-body referencing, and I'm doing spiral backline, but that's loading the lat and the ipsilateral side and the glute on the contralateral side, and I'm loading the glute, but I'm doing propulsion from the lat. And that dynamic as it goes through, like it just becomes easier to conceptualize these different planes and vectors. And then we start to look at really what the problem with gravity-based resistance. It's limited by your ability to concentrically load or propulsion. And if I can't react to that load that's pushing me down, essentially that becomes the rate limiting step. And one of the things about Flywheel, the rate limiting step isn't concentric, it's the ability to load, right? So if I can react to the load and I can drive fluids, now I can get more momentum into that propulsion. And you'll see that. There's a delayed eccentric. So if I pull harder, that all of a sudden now leads into a eccentric that doesn't account for here, and it's my ability to react by coming into this, or now I'm in a stable position, my fascial lines, my joint integrity, everything's in line, and I can get into a propulsive state, and that propulsive is now momentum, and I carry that back over. And that mimics a lot of sport actions. That mimics a lot of activities. And that mimics the things that we're trying to accomplish within sport in terms of change of direction, leading with decelerate, short amortization, utilizing stretch shortening cycle, utilizing the parallel elastic and series elastic component. The tissues and the management of fluids within those joints are now more challenged and more respective of a three-dimensional triplanar environment. And that becomes a thing that you start to covet and crave when you're looking at, like, I need to have this athlete more prepared. I don't have the tools at my disposal with a dumbbell or barbell. And yes, they are phenomenal in a lot of ways, from developing attributes and KPIs that are related to sprinting faster or jumping higher. But then we look at the correspondence, or that like missing gap within your programming, and it starts to click in a lot of ways. All right, the other thing to think about too is gravity is going to be most resistance when it's perpendicular. So if I'm doing a bicep curl, when my forearm is parallel to the ground, that's the greatest resistance. And that creates the resistance curve, or the resistance profile. So it's all about creatively trying to change that orientation to gravity to have more resistance on that joint and the tissues associated with it, where it's not necessarily the same for flywheel. It's going to be consistent and constant. So if you lack end range or shortened range, you're not going to have that same problem with flywheel. It's going to be consistent throughout the entirety of the motion. And it's isokinetic in a way that the harder you pull, the more resistance you get and the more eccentric loading you get. And it doesn't really matter if I'm perpendicular to gravity or not. It just matters the angular momentum of that wheel. And if I have a bigger wheel, that's going to be more force. And if I have a smaller wheel, that's going to be more velocity. And that leads into fixing force deficits. That leads into fixing velocity deficits more malleably. And you can start to think about, okay, like I have some limitations with gravity-based stuff that I don't really account for. And I found creative ways, whether it's accommodating resistance or changing the center of mass, changing the resistance arm, altering my body in space to just create more stress in certain parts or less stress. And it might lead into just a arbitrary, like I got more extra load by limiting range of motion, shortening the center of mass by lowering the bar in my back. That doesn't really equate or count for nothing. And then we can accentuate that further by adding a belt or wraps or straps or anything that might make holding the resistance easier, but it doesn't really quantifiably change the dynamics or correspondence that we're trying to do on the field, where it's just hard to do that with a flywheel. It's just really hard to cheat it. Like, it keeps you honest, and it keeps the resistance profile really, really applicable to what we need in sport. And from a hypertrophy standpoint, constant tension is king. Like, tension is the currency of hypertrophy. From a work capacity standpoint, it modulates the intensity by the velocity at which you're going, and you can go to the duration without having to stop or change weight or racket because you're losing. You essentially just titrate down the level of intent velocity, and you can keep going. Constant resistance, that's a big part of this. And I would love for you guys to just think about when you're going through a set of squat and you get through that sticking point, it becomes easier because you have more sarcomere overlap and you have more friends to the party. And you think about the end range or the beginning range. You think about the way you accommodate that. You think about how you push your butt back and drop your chest or lower the bar on your back. You really don't have those options with flywheel. And that's a really, really impactful part when you're trying to instill discipline. And I think about this a lot with high intensity training and the Arthur Jones, Mike Mentzer, Ellington Darden, all the great college football programs that use high intensity training. They were masters of the art of manipulating resistance to keep you going through, to not give in. That grit, that aspect of that. And you see people going through a challenging set of flywheel, and you see their grit and their determination and their ability to tolerate discomfort and pain, because lactic acid, through the research, is considerably higher during flywheel than a normal base pattern with gravity-based resistance. And that's one, a physiological response to the stress that you're under. But the other big part of that is it becomes this really impactful thing to the greater good of your performance. All right, a couple more slides here. So flywheel is inertia-based, so angular velocity propulsion force dictates the loading forces. So if I want to have a greater eccentric load, I just pull harder. And that's how you start to modulate that intensity. And we think about that, how that applies to the basic trainable patterns: walk, skip, shuffle, karaoke, jump, hop, 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 bound, drop, and hump, and then throw and toss. So med balls, hurdles, all that stuff we use. Our training patterns, we look at lower body squat, hinge, and we look at upper body push and pull. You can throw a lunge in there as well. We look at our planes. We have sagittal, frontal, transverse. We look at our vectors. We can start to think about vertical, horizontal, rotational. And now we're going to start to think about all this integrating, right? So what you're going to get now is an exercise inventory that's limitless. It has no upper limit. There you can do all those patterns in all those vectors with all those drivers, and you start to think about, okay, now I'm going in these different directions, these different orientations. I can use that flywheel in front of me. I can use it behind me. I can use it down. I can use it high. And now I can drive in all planes of motions, not worrying about that perpendicularness to gravity, what the resistance arm is, what the center of mass is, because it's going to be constant. It's going to be consistent, and you have to propulse all the way through to get that eccentric load or that loading that we're trying to get, and becomes more applicable to these movements that are harder to progressively overload or harder to just articulate what is it we're doing. And this is a basic tutorial on what the patterns break down to. And what you can see here is you can see the font gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and that's intentional because it just can keep going. It can keep going and get me overwhelmed like that. And then you look at a Pareto principle that 20% of the things that we do produce 80% of the results. Find that quick. And it could come down to a traditional squat, hinge, push, and pull. And then it could be accentuated to, okay, this person's an acyclical team sport. I need to do as much transverse frontal plane stuff as possible. How would I load a squat pattern or a hinge pattern in the transverse plane? Maybe it's a driver from the top down. Maybe it's a positional from the bottom up. I'm just changing my stance. I'm going split stance, a lateral stance, or posterior lateral stance. And I'm driving all these different feedback mechanisms with these time-tested, proven patterns. But I'm looking at competency, and I'm creating the systemic effect with constant loading and really allowing them to auto-regulate that load by their propulsive ability, which increases the eccentric or the loading. And then the final aspect, and this is, I think, part where you're probably, again, like, have more questions than answers. Whenever you feel like gravity-based resistance isn't getting the job done, that's when you want to start thinking about alternative forms of resistance. And my default right now, and I still really like a pneumatic resistance from Kaiser. I still really like some band stuff. But the more and more I use Flywheel, the more and more I realize how invaluable that is for doing the stuff that I know I need to do is just hard to do or justify. And I have the feedback that I really, really need for that athlete to go, okay, I'm not just wasting my time doing just arbitrary things to check a box to do transverse or frontal plane or rotational or horizontal vector. And that part for me, and it's worth its weight in gold. All right, we're going to stop there. We're going to go into contraction types. This is my favorite lecture. I always have the book Strength Deficit. So you guys got a big one coming up. Let's stay on board. And then we got programming reviews, and that'll be it.